I changed my name to Willy when I was 9 in 1972. And I fought with my school, my family, my community to be recognized for my name change. Took my mother 15 years to get with it. There was no such thing as a trans affirming school. You know, no one gave a shit about trans people or understood anything about trans people, and there was no positive conversation about trans people in any way. Back then, there were no resources on HIV prevention for trans bodies or trans identity and experience. People were so much at risk because of fluctuating self-esteem. It was really about how people were just being treated like crap, that they were engaging in risk behaviors because it was kind of like, well, I'm just gonna get it, why not? In late 1988, I found out about a job about working with people on the streets who are at risk for HIV and on the streets of the Tenderloin with injection drug users and sex workers. There was a lot of misinformation and a lack of awareness about HIV transmission. So a lot of the job was really helping people understand how HIV was transmitted and how HIV was not. And then it was also really helping people connect to whatever services there were. And at that time, there were still very few services. I was also the first transgender person to do that work, although as someone who had not medically transitioned, I was not really viewed as a legitimate trans person. I was also the first Asian community health outreach worker here in San Francisco, as well as around on the West Coast, and I was focused on providing HIV education and prevention services for the Asian and Pacific Islander communities. In the Tenderloin, which was largely Southeast Asian, in Chinatown, which was a mix of Chinese, Filipino, and Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander folks, and south of Market, which was primarily Filipino. And I also was the first provider to access women working in massage parlors who were saying, oh, no, we don't need condoms. And then when I went inside and we had some conversations, then they would accept the condoms and we would talk about HIV prevention and so forth. Back in the 80s and the 90s, there was never good data collection on trans folks. And so we were documenting the outreach that we were doing, what conversations we were having, and what the issues were that were going on for the folks on the streets. Trans women were documented as men who have sex with men or as cisgender women, which skewed the risk picture for cisgender women. And neither was accurate, and neither really recognized the specific challenges that trans women, trans feminine folks were dealing with. Trans masculine folks were not acknowledged or documented in any way. Around 1990, a colleague said to me, "Can you imagine a transgender man who's gay?" Like, it was so hard for people to wrap their minds around that. There was very little understanding of trans men or trans masculine experience, or the risk picture for trans masculine folks. Of course, now we have SOGI data collection, which stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and we're looking at how do we ask people about their gender identity. We have much better tools in collecting data on who's trans, and yet it still it's still a challenge in that not everybody wants to disclose. People are concerned about what that might mean for their care if they are disclosing in healthcare settings. People are much more aware that we really need to look at the layers of oppression that people are experiencing. That trans folks are not just experiencing transphobia, which is hard enough on its own to deal with, but people are dealing with racism and classism and ableism. There's so many different isms around, homophobia, transphobia, sexism in different ways. The ways in which people are experiencing hate violence and discrimination and police harassment, it's all about those intersections around race, gender, sexuality, gender identity and expression. So many trans folks are struggling to survive. People are dealing with a lack of family acceptance. A lot of times people do have to flee their homes because of violence and, physical and emotional. Challenges around lack of acceptance in society, in school, and in their community, just from childhood for many folks. A lot of times people end up on the streets, working the streets because they don't have other options. And for many trans feminine folks in particular, there's such rampant employment discrimination that people had to resort to sex work even if that wasn't what they wanted to do. For many people, it was very affirming, or has been very affirming for them in terms of their gender identity. Trans men were talking about how they were engaging in risky sexual practices with cisgender gay men because it was affirming to them as a man and as a gay man. What do we do when we want to be affirmed for who we are? And especially when we don't feel loved and accepted, that can be a very challenging place to be in. And so sometimes people are engaging in behaviors that they might not have otherwise, but they're feeling like, oh, this is an opportunity to feel affirmed and seen for who I am. Sex work is the exchange of money or other goods for sexual activity. Why do trans people do it? To survive. It's one way in which people can survive. If you're undocumented, if you're limited English speaking, if you can't get a job just because you're trans for whatever reason, it's one way that folks can get some cash and be able to pay their rent, get something to eat. Trans masculine folks have been participating in sex work all these years just as alongside trans feminine folks, but it's not something that we talk about or is acknowledged as often, often for the same reasons, to survive. One of the biggest victories of the transgender movement is insurance. It's getting transition-related care covered by insurance. Because, this can be transformative for folks, for people to be able to access the health care that they need to be able to be perceived as the gender that they identify with, to be consistently perceived as the gender they identify with. That can go a long way in boosting mental health status and in, living the life that they want to do. But not only that, as someone who has been working with providers for the last 30 years, being able to access culturally competent care, people who really have a genuine understanding of trans experience, people who care about trans people. In 1995, and San Francisco was one of the first jurisdictions in the country to get discrimination protections based on gender identity and expression. And then we got some state and federal funding to be able to conduct research. And so it was through that process that we really became much more empowered as a community. This was the first time that we weren't treated as just the subject being studied, but we were actually participating in every aspect of the research. And so over time, it went from trans people just being considered to be the clients and consumers of services to then trans people taking leadership positions and, folks saying, hey, I used to be working the streets, now I'm a health educator. And, people becoming empowered in their career path and also in their abilities to get back to the community and really help the community. In terms of education, prevention, and providing services. The AIDS crisis is not over. I think a lot of people think, this is an historical issue. Historically, yes, the challenges were much worse than they are now. But I think so many of the issues that we faced in the 80s, we continue to face. In San Francisco and in major cities, there are a lot of resources, but for folks who aren't living in hubs that have resources, people are dealing with a lot of the lack of resources and ignorance that we were dealing with 30 years ago. We still have so far to go globally. We still have so far to go in the U.S. And I want to see the day when everyone is celebrated for being their true self. I want to see the day when families and schools and communities and religious institutions and workplaces celebrate when we say, this is who I am. And people say, yeah, be yourself. Be who you are.